All you need is a little juju. All you need is a little juju. All you need is a little juju. All you need. Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Little Juju podcast. And hopefully, right now, you are watching on JujuTube, aka YouTube, so you are able to see me and the lovely Professor Chireau that we have today. Thank you so much for coming and being on A Little Juju podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank
Of
you.
course. I'm so happy. So, for those of you all who don't know, which if you listen to the podcast, you probably know who Professor Chireau is because I've talked about the book Black Magic a lot. It is one of my favorite hoodoo books. I think it's necessary reading if you are a hoodoo, want to be a hoodoo, or interested in hoodoo. This book is so important and has been pivotal in my own journey. So, get the book, y'all. I just gotta say that if you want to know more about hoodoo. But Professor Chireau, like, before we get into that and your book and what I love about it, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, like your spiritual background? Like, how were you raised spiritually? And where are you
Okay.
from?
Okay. All right. So this is good. So, but I just have to say, so my husband said to me today, well, what are you doing today? Because he's a professor too. I
Hmm.
said, well, I'm talking to jujubae. He was like, what's that? And I was like, I know. Well, she is, I said, she's a podcaster. She does this and this, and she's an influencer. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, it's something that these young people do. And then I realized that I'm a 20th century person. They didn't have this back then.
Hmm.
And it really made me think about something because I'm technically an elder now. I just turned 60. But the past, more than anything, is present. And I'm going to
Mm.
talk a little bit about that today when we get into it. But what I'm seeing is that the young people, and in particular, young people who are spiritual and into African spirituality, they are reaching the path for validation. Even though we live in the future, the internet, and the digital, and the influences, and all this stuff, what we really are doing is recovering our past, and particularly and it's happening with everything we do. So I just thought about that this morning because we were like, oh, this is something that the young people do in the digital. And, it's true, but at the same time, the past is present. The
Hmm.
past is present. So as far as me, so I'm from New York originally. My father he's gone now. He was an immigrant from the French Antilles. That's the West Indies, the French West Indies.
Hmm.
And my mother she's from originally from the South, but her roots are very hard to trace, like most of us. But she was raised in New York too. So growing up in New York at the time, we lived in St. Albans, which was a Black community that was
Hmm.
kind of changing. And then, became more mixed, and then it changed. But at the time, uh, we were bused into the schools in New York. We were bused. It was the busing thing. And that was where I really began to think about, wow, what, education and
Hmm.
history and all the things that, as kids, you don't really think about. As far as my religious experience, uh, my father put me into the Catholic school and I hated it.
Hmm.
That didn't last because that was so difficult. And then we went to the public school where we were bused. But I jumped around from different traditions. I was always fascinated by religion. Catholicism fascinated me, but it didn't reach my heart.
Hmm.
Um, as I got older, we became part of the Black church, several different Black churches. And then as I got older into college, I was investigating multiple religions. So
Hmm.
my journey was naturally very diverse and eclectic. I think all of us have that. We have a yearning to find something. We can't name it.
Hmm.
We can't tell what it is. This is just something that drove me a lot. I did
Okay.
not know that you could do this for a living, though. I didn't
Hmm.
know there was such a thing as religion professors.
Hmm.
But it sort of opened up to me because of my love for this.
Okay. That sounds a lot like my background too. Very diverse, very eclectic, Catholic
Yeah,
school, trying a whole
yeah,
bunch of different things and
yeah.
studying. And yes, I identify with that. So now, how would you identify yourself religiously or spiritually, if you're okay with saying?
Well, I'm not part of the church. I do not consider myself a Christian, but I think most of us in the United States, whether or not we identify as Christians, it's like it's an umbrella that informs everything we do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have been initiated into an African-based religion,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not practicing. I'm not in the priesthood. So what I find is that I love it all. I consider myself a priest to my ancestors. That's
Mm-hmm.
really where I am now, and
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those things that I hear more and more people coming to. I serve ancestors. And the thing is, the beautiful thing about ancestral reference, not ancestral worship, is that you can come from any religion. And
Yep.
that's what I'm seeing too. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I would not put a label on myself, except I really want to see myself as a scholar or an investigator.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say an investigator of religions.
Mm-hmm.
They're all good.
Mm-hmm.
Even the ones that we don't like,
Mm-hmm.
they're all good to me.
Okay, Ashe, I received that. So let's talk a little bit about hoodoo. Let's talk a little bit about conjure. What was your first? So it's so interesting. I guess my question is, how do you define hoodoo? Let's start there.
Yeah, isn't that great? So, this is like a double question because there's the family experience, the cultural experience that we have in our
Right.
first encounter, and then
Mhm.
there's the academic side or whatever we read,
Right.
academic or whatever. So, my first encounter was through, hearing about it through the family, those whispers, those hush tones.
Mhm.
And in fact, my mother had a hoodoo story with her first husband, but she didn't tell me till later.
Mhm.
Um, the academic side was where I first began to try to struggle to come up with a definition. And this is something, by the way, that people who study religion often struggle with. Religion is a creation of the academy, it's a creation of the scholars. In and of itself, religion does not exist. It's as if you're
Mm.
trying to take a portion of one's life or one's culture, pull it out artificially, and say, that's religion. And we know that's sort of a classification game. So it's not real, but it doesn't stop, religion people from arguing about it for 100 years when we arguing about it.
Right.
So as far as hoodoo is concerned, the way that I define it, I see it as an African American ancestral tradition
Mhm.
by which Black people related to the spiritual and the supernatural realm. And that last piece often gets me into trouble because one of the things that we've learned, and this is all very recent, I would say in the past 30 years, we know a lot more about how to think about religion, but the idea of the supernatural
Mhm.
or a realm or a notion or a concept that exists beyond what is natural, that's an artificial understanding, particularly of indigenous religions, whether they're African or Native American Indian religions. There is no supernatural, there is no
Mhm.
separation.
Right.
So, even using that kind of terminology, which is borrowed from kind of our Western
Mhm.
scientific classification, it just doesn't work. And that happens again and again when you try to look at Africana. I use the term Africana to include religions of the diaspora and
Right.
Africa. When you try to study them or when you try to look at them, they don't fit into any of the boxes. So that's how
Right.
I got into it. I was like, what is this?
Mhm.
It doesn't, I'm reading these sources about slavery, and this is why I went into religion. I really, really wanted to know more about slavery and religion. There was only one person who wrote one book on it, and actually, he's eBay. He passed away today. His name is Albert Rabbitoe. He wrote the only book on slave religion, and I said,
Mm.
I'm going to work with this guy.
Mhm.
And I was so arrogant. He was at Princeton. I was like, I want to work with
Wow.
him because I want to learn. And so I went to Princeton,
Mhm.
and it was meant to be. But
Mhm.
he looked at the religion of slaves and or enslaved people. And what he found was there was a hidden world. He calls this the invisible institution, the
Hmm.
invisible institutions of religion. And within that hidden world, there was a religion, a magic, however you term it, that people didn't have a word for. We now call it hoodoo, conjure, goofer. It's regional voodoo. It
Mhm.
depends on where you are. But trying to understand what our ancestors, what enslaved people did, that it just wasn't done. So Professor Rabbitoh wrote this book, and I was like, there's like one little chapter, not even a chapter, a few pages about conjuring. And I was like, that's what I'm going to study. And
Yeah.
so out of that, I wrote my dissertation, which became a book. But a
Mhm.
lot of these ideas are emerging,
Right.
and this is. And let me just say one more thing, because I know, and I tell this to my students. I know y'all ain't going to major in religion. I know y'all ain't going to major in history. Everybody wants to make some money, but being able to tell the story of your ancestors,
Mhm.
of Black people, was such an honor and a privilege, because prior to, I would say even prior to I was in school in the 80s, the 1970s, it was not us that was
Right.
telling the story. That became a mission for me and a lot of people in that generation. And again, my professor was, he's a, God bless him, Black man, but one out of, so many people who looked at this. So I tell this to my students, you don't have to major in this. You don't have to, it would be great, but you really do want to be about telling your own story. It's a kind of empowerment to be able to
Mhm.
tell your own, instead of having someone else tell your story or name you.
Mhm.
And so with hoodoo, and even that, we see that, and I'm sure we're going to get into that. Who gets to name hoodoo and what it is? Who gets to call it, what it is?
Mhm.
So important that we do this, and I'm speaking specifically about Black people.
Right.
We can talk about the other people later.
Mhm.
Okay.
And oh, there's so many good things that you said. When bringing hoodoo or quote unquote magic or whatever to the academic space,
Yeah.
I guess what are some pros that come with that, and also some cons that come with putting our traditions out to be studied and investigated in that particular way? And I think about this even with me having a podcast about this and creating a platform rooted in our traditions. Like, what have you found sort of has been beneficial to that, but also could be a drawback um,
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
in these definitions and defining and so on and so forth.
that's a really good question. And it's a really good question in part because we're dealing with living traditions, right?
Right.
So, where I work, in my department, there are people that study, I call them dead, but that's rude, right? But religions that aren't, so ancient religions, they look
Mhm.
at texts and books and things like that. But the people who study living traditions, by and large, it's Islam, Christianity, and maybe Judaism.
Right.
It's only recently that we can even talk about indigenous African religions as a living tradition. And if you think about that, that's extraordinary, right?
Hmm.
Because they, I have some friends, God bless them, evangelicals, fundamentalists, and so forth. They're like this, they probably hope that African religions would go the way of, the Greek religions. They want them to come into the 20th, 21st century. They're
Yeah.
trying to convert people from indigenous religions. So the idea that these ancient religions are alive and well and growing, that is profound.
Yes.
That is worth study, because that's the question I get. I get calls all the time, and I wrote my book over 20 years ago. They're like, "Oh, what is this thing? What are these people doing? What are these young people doing? Why are people turning back to these things?" So
Hmm.
to me, that is one of the benefits of studying the religions. Now, let me just say this, and you probably know this, and your listeners know this. I mentioned evangelicals and Christians, Christian missionaries, and so forth. God bless them all. I don't
Hmm.
hold much against them. They were the ones who were, to their benefit, studying African and indigenous religions. We have missionaries from the 15th century
Yep.
that go into Africa and they study and they report back, and then they bring the guns,
Hmm.
the guns
Right.
behind them. So the scholarship of this stuff has been going on way, way longer, but
Yes.
it's been done mainly from within the Christian and theological tradition. So for that reason, I think that bringing this into the academy, bringing this into scholarship is really, really important. And then that
Mhm.
other reason that I gave before, we get to tell our own story. So when I
Yes.
started, there were very few Black people, and nobody wanted to get a PhD. I think that's changing, although, it's kind of tricky now because people want to make money. Getting a PhD don't guarantee you no money, but it's changing. So you
Mhm.
get to recover your own story. That is also a challenge. And this is the challenge. I guess this is the con part. Um, when you put people under a microscope, that's the work of anthropology, right? To
Mhm.
study the human condition. There are ways that people do this. Do you remember, or that the anthropologists would go into the field and go and live among the primitive people, and they would bring a lot of baggage to
Yes.
studying people. So anthropology itself had to change and
Mhm.
adjust this to this. That's sort of recent. The con of it, and the thing that I get pushback from my students a lot of times, is that, well, Black folk, we don't want to be studied. We don't want to be put under the microscope. And if we're going to be studied, it better be Black people studying us.
Right.
That hasn't been the case. And
Mhm.
and unfortunately, it's not really the case for Africana religions. It's changing. I can name on both hands the people that I know that actually do this, but there's a real tension and a suspicion, as you can understand, because people used to go into our communities, study, and then, present their findings. And
Right.
sometimes the findings were really problematic, sometimes they were good. Sam, the same thing happens with hoodoo and conjure.
Mm.
All right.
Mhm.
So outsiders, I'm sure y'all know some of the famous books from the 20th century. A lot of them were written by white people, of
Mhm.
white scholars. Some of them weren't even white scholars. One of them is by an Episcopalian priest named Hyatt. They go into Black communities and they're trying to get information, and then they go and publish it. Zora Neale Hurston was the exception. She was a black scholar who
Mhm.
went into the field, who went into these communities to study hoodoo and magic, and then presented her findings in different ways.
Mhm.
There's a lot of suspicion about that. And
Yeah.
then the third part, which is what I think you're probably going to get to, is practitioners going into those communities. And I'll say it. I was going to say stealing, but someone's challenging me on that.
Hmm.
Adopting and appropriating the things that they learn about and study, and then reinterpreting it or presenting it as their own. So that's a big issue, and that's something that I really want to look closer at. I've been asked to speak about that actually next year.
Mhm.
Um, the idea that outsiders to a tradition, what it means to go in and draw from that tradition, and then come up with your own thing, which
Right.
is very American. It's very American. It's not unique, but that's the cons.
Mhm.
That's the problem part.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Hmm. So in talking about how at least back in the day it was probably less Black people going into communities and studying hoodoo and presenting findings for a variety of reasons. Now, obviously, more people are doing that. I've been interviewed so many times for college students, people getting dissertations. Like, I always say yes to the students who are wanting to know more about hoodoo.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
I definitely see that there is a space and a desire to learn, to present, to be Black, to tell our own stories.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a difference from the way people hoodooed back in the day to the way people hoodoo now, like my generation? And I'm curious just what your perceptions are about what are some similarities and maybe some changings to the definition of hoodoo or how people are quote unquote hoodooing. I don't know why I'm using that word, or conjuring. Just like, do you notice any kind of like, oh, we never said that, or this is different, or I'm just curious about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a good question. I urge and encourage everyone who's a practitioner to understand the history. I'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you why in a second. The history of these traditions, sometimes called hoodoo, sometimes called conjure, sometimes called root or voodoo, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But because if you don't know what people did back then, you make it up. There's
Yes.
nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm finding today is that it's a very eclectic tradition. I find that young people, particularly young Black people, I'm not talking about the people who embrace hoodoo as a commodity. And again, I'm not making any judgment on any of this. I'm actually fascinated, but there are people who just dabble. They're dilettantes. It's like, okay, I'll buy this, I'll do this. But
Right.
the people who are like, okay, I want to understand this, apply it to my life, study it seriously. So to answer your question, it's like, well, yeah, they do it differently from back then, but even back then they were doing it differently. So hoodoo itself has evolved and changed. It evolved immediately after emancipation, right?
Mm.
And I'm not going to use the word evolve. It was transformed
Mhm.
after emancipation, after Black people left the context of slavery. It moved with people. It is a highly adaptable tradition to the
Yes.
environment. So, depending on when you're talking about, yeah, people today are taking what they need or taking what they want. They're picking, they're choosing. I find a lot of people today, when I say today, like right now, 21st century, are more willing to adapt their hoodoo tradition and include things like tarot or
Mm.
crystals or things that we would normally associate, or even witchcraft, which is something I was talking to someone about recently, that we would normally not associate with the African and the African based traditions. I see a lot more of that today than I even did in the early 2000s, late 1990s, when I began to look at that. So yeah, people are practitioners today are feel more free to do
Mm.
that, to include other aspects. We could argue whether that's appropriating, because this is like the big argument that I think people are getting into. That okay, white people appropriate Black tradition, but Black people appropriate white tradition. So what are you
Ooh.
doing with the tarot? What are you doing with tarot? Things like that. So again, I don't like the fights, but the fights again have been going on. When I say hoodoo fights have been going on, I'm sorry,
Okay.
since uh since the 1800s and even earlier.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I kind of lost the beginning of your question too, and I'm sorry about that because the phone rang. What was the first part of your question?
Oh,
I
it
made
was
a
just
note.
what were some of the differences and similarities that you
Oh,
may
okay.
see?
Okay. The biggest difference, and I want to stress this, but I don't seem to be getting it across to people, is that hoodoo was born in slavery for enslaved people.
Mm.
Okay, it was a religion, a spirituality, a magic, whatever category you use, of resistance. All
Mhm.
right, we are not enslaved. We do not require, we have similar needs as our enslaved ancestors, but we are not enslaved. So just thinking about the differences conceptually in what a magical or even a religious tradition would offer and do for an enslaved person whose life, their agency, their bodies were under domination, control, constant oppression, danger. We're not like that anymore.
Mm.
Thank God we're not like that anymore.
Right.
I find people act like we like that. I find that they enact almost a an experience of complete lack of freedom, but we're not there anymore. And our ancestors, I'll just put that to the side. So that to me is one of the big differences.
Mm.
Hoodoo practitioners or practitioners of Africana spiritualities today do not have to do the same things that our ancestors did during slavery. So
Okay.
what does that mean, Professor Chireau? Does that mean that, we can't resist oppression in the same way? I don't think so. I
Hmm.
don't think so. And we're going into sort of a metaphysical level. I
Mhm.
don't think so. I think that hoodoo, not that it's inappropriate for the kind of resistance that we're dealing with today, but some aspects are simply they're not appropriate. Okay, so I
Hmm.
just contradicted myself. So there was this thing, I might have talked to you about this before, when Donald Trump got elected in 19 2016.
Mhm.
A number of and friends of mine, uh, people who are magic practitioners, a lot of white people too, wanted to get together and do collective rituals. And it was actually very soon after he got elected. So he hadn't even really done anything except open his mouth.
Mhm.
And they wanted to do rituals of resistance and, hexing and spells. And, this is a
Yes,
lot
I
of this coming
saw
out of the
that.
pagan and witchcraft community. And
Mhm.
I was like, that's not a good idea. And this is why. And there were a few people in that community who said that's not a good idea. And this is why. And, it was all of the gamut. I did not see many Black people doing that. And I think, and I'm not sure why, but I was happy about that.
Mhm.
For a number of different reasons. And I'm not being judgmental. I'm not the kind of person that says your magic is wrong. But there are a lot of reasons why that kind of spell work is, may not work. Um,
Right.
Fast forward to today, we have the uprisings. I mean, I talked to you about this before. We have the protests after the death of George Floyd, and Hoodoo practitioners want to, find a way to utilize the magical tradition
Mhm.
in this moment to address, the current moment that they find themselves in: oppression, white supremacy, racism, and so forth. You thinking about you in this moment versus your enslaved ancestor, who's being whipped, raped, whatever they
Right.
did to us, it's a very different use of the power of hoodoo. I
Yes.
don't see us going all Gullah Jack. All right, so Gullah Jack, as your listeners know, was a freedom fighter in South
Mhm.
Carolina in the 18th century. um I don't see us doing that. And I have an idea that I do see us doing things. I know that you were out there doing it during the protests. I've talked to you about this. I know that others are out there supporting and uplifting the Black community.
Mhm.
The alternative is to go Gullah Jack, or even further, to take the route of the magical spirituality of Haiti, of Haiti,
Mhm.
which led to revolution.
Mhm.
At that point, and I'm calling voodoo magic slash religion because it's one of these wonderful things that doesn't fit into our categories. But with voodoo, there's no turning back. All right, so you die for your freedom. I don't
Mhm.
know if Black Americans are there. That's the kind of thing that I heard growing up in the 70s. Oh yeah, we're gonna die for our freedom. We're not there anymore. We're in a different place. So this is my understanding
Mhm.
of the relevance of hoodoo, of this kind of magical spirituality. And you might know more about this, talking to your, talking to other practitioners. I don't know if the emphasis is on the left hand work, or the killing, or the poisoning,
Hmm.
which was, I won't say a major part, but it was a good part of
Yeah.
hoodoo back in the 18th and 19th century. I don't see that today. I know people throw stuff on each other, they do all kinds of stuff. But again, the all or nothing, taking the life kind of thing, I don't see that these days. And I don't know if I want to, but I
Mhm.
haven't investigated that. So I think my main point is that we are not where our ancestors are in terms of the kind of resistance, life or death resistance struggle that we
Right.
found ourselves in. Now, someone could argue this against me, because I have people who say, yes, we are. We're being killed, we're being lynched. Literally, I had a student say it is just as bad as it was back in the 18th,
Mhm.
the 1800s. And I looked at her like she had two heads,
Mhm.
because I'm like, I'm a student of history. And for me, that's an impossible statement. So this
Right.
is this is my strong feeling. I can be
Mm.
convinced, I can be argued with, but I see that the kind of hoodoo that's called for today, particularly when we're talking about resistance, it's not so much a resistance against, white supremacy and oppression, but it's about resisting that which brings our community, that pulls our community apart.
Right.
So I know a lot of people are turning, instead of to left hand, or I don't, there's different terms, to aggressive magic, are turning to ancestral traditions.
Mhm.
So you don't fight with your ancestors, you lift them up, because that's where you get the power.
Right.
I would ask people who disagree with me, and that's fine because I love arguments. What is the source of power that you're using in order to resist the conditions that you find yourself under. So we're
Mm,
getting into the weeds. I'm just saying that I feel that this is one of the big differences between the experience that we're having now as a people and the experience that our ancestors had collectively, that they survived and many didn't survive.
mhm,
The stakes are still high, but it
mhm.
calls for a different kind of magic. And
Right.
that's all I'll say. I'm not preaching. I'm not telling anyone what to do. This is sort of my observation.
Mhm.
So that's my way out.
Ooh, that was good. Okay, I have thoughts.
Okay, good, good, good.
So I totally agree that we are not living in the same conditions as our ancestors who were enslaved were living under. That is that's just I could never fix my lips to say anything like that. Because we're just not. We have a certain semblance of freedom that they don't have. We can't say that we're completely free, of course not, but no, I'm not waking up and someone owns my body, and tells me exactly what to do every day. Now, I felt there was a point where you said like hoodoo now it almost or I interpret it as maybe hoodoo is not a necessary practice for us in this day and age because it was born out of enslavement and we are not enslaved as it was born out of. Um, and we also talked about hoodoo being evolutionary or being transformative. And
Mhm.
so it can it then still be relevant now, but transform to what we need it to do, but still but it's still a necessary part of who we are, of Black folks culturally that we could never divorce ourselves from.
Mhm.
And I will also say that, as a younger practitioner in community with older and younger practitioners, I think a lot of younger practitioners are actually resisting in the ways of being willing to lose something and doing the left hand work and doing the left hand and
Mhm.
not necessarily through
Mhm. Mhm.
hexing Donald Trump,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
but
Mhm.
when we're in the midst of uprisings and we're studying the roots that are protective, we're
Mhm.
studying the prayers that were said that were used before the pig was slaughtered in Haiti.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
I think that we actually are doing that, and young people are particularly doing that because we feel that there is a level of like oppression that we experience that, of course, it doesn't look like our ancestors' oppression, but it's still oppression and it's
Yeah.
still worth fighting, whether it's an uplifting Black folks or if your work is the left hand work, if your work is the hexing, if your work is I mean, we can't poison our slave masters anymore. We don't have those, but we can't. People are doing juju on things
Yeah.
that do
Yeah.
oppress us. They are, and on the buildings that do it, and where those people work.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
um,
Yes. Yes.
I just had to say that
Yeah,
part
no,
too.
no, no. You, and I agree with everything you're saying. I'm not saying that it's not appropriate. I'm not saying that hoodoo is not
Mhm.
appropriate. I actually think we need to broaden our definition of what hoodoo is because the
Mm.
associations are, oh yeah, that's that stuff that people do. That's that work.
Yes.
It's very negative and it's very scary, and that's the thing that I've been trying to that's one of the reasons why I nearly stopped doing this. It was like
Mm.
people are enamored with the violence, they're enamored with the
Mm.
it's like my work on voodoo. They're enamored with zombies and violence and sex and all this stuff that I've lost interest in, maybe because I'm too old, but also I understand that that becomes a glamour in this
Yes.
world. It becomes a distraction. So as far as the appropriateness and as far as resistance, um, left hand work, and there are other words that people use for this. My point is, and this I'm coming at this as a historian.
Mhm.
At a time in slavery, uh, and this is the question I get asked a lot. Well, if hoodoo, mainly from people who aren't practitioners, if this stuff works, and actually mainly from Christian people, and Christian people includes a lot of hoodoo practitioners
Yes,
because
it does.
it's embedded in that. Well, if this stuff worked, why didn't Black people use it to get free? And so I tell them the story of Gullah Jack. I tell them the story of individual people, less so collective practices that people used to secure their freedom. But
Right.
it did make me think about all the cases, many, 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 many more cases that I found in that early period of Black people doing stuff to other people. It became part of the social fabric. It became part of the way that people expressed grievances against each other. Almost so, it was what I guess they would call it black on black hoodoo. Black on black hoodoo became more prevalent, okay, according to the documents that I've read. Now, a lot of
Mm.
this is a secret system. So when I did this work, I had to dig deep
Yeah.
into documents. People yeah, it was bad. They were killing, they were poisoning their own.
Yes.
And so I'm looking at that. I'm saying, wow, this is something, you know. They did the work of the oppressor for them. But it's also very normal because it became part of a function within
Mhm.
these usually tight, smaller communities, in enslaved communities, whether it's on plantations or whatever, where people adjudicated their grievances. But at some point, it's like ridiculous. You know, it's to me, it's like ridiculous. You're killing yourself more than these other people. I feel
Mm.
that way sometimes today. So when
Mhm.
you ask me, well, what can Hoodoo do today? For people in terms of resistance, I'm like, there's resistance in the Black community that needs to be worked on. All right. So yes, I understand police violence. I understand state violence and oppression. But when people are doing stuff to each other, okay, when people are committing violence or sexual assault and abuse
Mhm.
on their own, I'm like, wow,
Mm.
where should the resistance be directed? And
Mm.
how can Hoodoo
Mhm.
address that? And that's where I think we need
Mhm.
to do a lot more talking about hoodoo as a healing system and
Yes.
not so much as a harming system. And I talk about that in my book a little. Okay, that was
Yes.
a mouthful.
No, that was so good. And I'm so glad that you brought that up because I think we do talk a lot about hoodoo in resistance to white domination, perversion, supremacy, and what could hoodoo and I'm asking this, but I see it in practice, but like how can hoodoo support us as black people with other black people? How does it uplift us as black people? How does it bring us more together as a community? And I think it does that too. I think that there is this iteration of hoodoo now that is of course about you know the addressing the oppressive natures, but also it's bringing families together. It's people having conversations with their grandmothers that they were never having before. I'm one of them and other members of my family. Like
Yeah.
it's bringing me to people like you and the podcast and other people who are finding so much healing. I get emails every single day of the
Yeah.
work that Hoodoo is doing. That's not about left
Yeah.
hand work, even though I don't mind left hand work. It's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with left hand work, but I kind of feel like I get to see the full spectrum of what it is doing. And I think that these conversations and continuing these conversations more around how can it support us, the sexual violence in our own families, how can Hoodoo support that? Like what are the herbs that help heal us from grief? Like these are things that these are things people are talking about.
Yes, there you go. And I think we need more of that because
Hmm.
again, we really I'm not going to say me because I'm a squeamish person when it comes
Hmm.
to violence, but in this world we seem to gravitate toward the glamour of the
Mm.
violent power, of
Mm.
dominating power.
Hmm.
And so when you talk about healing, it's healing is really just about balancing out that dominating violent thing,
Hmm.
whether it's a disease or whether it's mental oppression or grief, as you put. So
Hmm.
I'd like to see more of an emphasis on that, but we can hardly get to that because there's such a glamour
Mm.
around. And when I say that, I'm really talking about the public perception of
Sure.
voodoo. We've gotten past the voodoo stuff, I think. Although I don't know.
Nah.
There's some movies out. There's some
Uh-uh.
movies that came out. I'm like, yo, doing this again. And
Yeah.
they're like, yeah, that's a good movie. I'm like, that's, I could have seen that in the 1930s.
Yeah.
So, but the healing, the balancing, the integration of these energies, whether they're the energies of the spirits or whether it's the
Hmm.
energy of the leaf as the root worker does. To me, so
Mm.
I'm sort of leaning on that side. And I
Okay.
agree, we're seeing more of that, but I still think the perception, and it just occurred to me, the reason that many people gravitate to hoodoo and Africana magic is because of the power. So
Yes.
power is something that can be used to heal or to harm. And I talk
Yes.
about this a lot in my book. It's more this it's not even that you're defending yourself. It's because our world is so filled with anger, rage, resentment, you know, you know, and here comes my bell hook side.
Mm-hmm.
We could use a lot more love power. And I don't mean the kumbaya, I mean the real love power. And that side of hoodoo, it hasn't been, in my experience, explored in the same way. You're making these vital connections.
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of young people that are,
Mm-hmm.
but the way to get there and the way to do this is what I started out with, is to go back to the ancestors, go back to the
Yes.
altar, go back
Yes.
to yourself and your own divinity. So that's the part that people want to jump over
Mm-hmm.
because they mad.
Right.
They've been done wrong.
Right.
You know what I mean? So healing is harder than this other kind of
Yes.
work. This other kind of work, it could be quick and it's like gratifying. So that to me, I want to see that. And I think that's yet a lesson that young people are learning um right now in this day and age.
I was gonna ask when you were talking about the perception of hoodoo. I was wondering if you meant like media perception, white people's perception, black people's perception. But honestly, I think a lot of the perception is the same.
Yeah,
Because when you talk
yeah,
about the violence, I think people who are in it, who are committed to learning about it, understand that conjure is all encompassing. But
yeah,
people outside of it, even when we're talking about Christian folk or whoever, when they want to hurt someone, harm someone, get something back, they go to the root worker. They don't typically, in my experience or what I've read, go to the root worker or the conjurer to
yeah,
heal their
yeah,
sometimes, but I know
yeah,
that a lot of it is, oh, I know that this my man's cheating on me.
yeah,
I
yeah.
I'm
That's
having
right.
this experience with this lady up the street and she need to be dealt with. And so there still is that perception. I know I can go to the juju lady to get control and
Yeah,
cause harm to someone. And I don't know if people are going to the juju lady
yeah.
because I'm trying to heal my heart. Um
Exactly, exactly. That's it. That's the next stage. I will see this before I pass on. So much of
mm,
what we're talking about, and it's not just Black American magic traditions, but it's magic everywhere, and it's also religion, is about this victimizer and victim
mm,
complex that all of us find ourselves in. It's a kind of, and you know this as as someone who studied psychology.
mhm,
Um, there that must be healed, that must be balanced
mm,
out, to the point where we're not victims or victimizers, so
mm.
that we can truly be free in this thing. um I want to see that, but that's the hard work, because it's, we're all victims or we're all victimizers. There's and especially
Yeah.
black people, we must resolve this thing. We're neither. We're neither. And that's really a
Mm,
philosophical discussion, but
mm.
I think we will see this, in my lifetime, because all magics have to evolve. All
Yes.
magics have to evolve, or else, they're useless.
Yep.
And so I'm seeing a lot of, healing justice, young people talking about this. um I've yet to see how hoodoo, and one of the reasons why this is, Sam, is because there's no one hoodoo.
Right.
And once y'all got on the internet, it's like, well, there's all kinds of hoodoos. There's all
Yes.
kinds of hoodoo work. But I would say that if you were to ask me, what is the common basis of all hoodoo work, and I'm talking about Africana hoodoo,
Mhm.
because there are others. It's that ancestral link,
Yes.
linking to that ancestral heritage. That is I mean, and you could do that as a Christian, you could do that as a Muslim, you could
Mhm.
do that whether or not you have religion. But that is the energy that's going to give the power and the validation to your work. So I think when I first met you, when you came to the college, you were talking about, how to set up an altar.
Mhm.
And it was one of the things that students have asked me about.
Mhm.
This is something that is just, I've never seen anything like it,
Mhm.
that people are turning to
Yes.
their ancestral kin. They're
Mhm.
turning to their lineage, because people tend to think that if you work with ancestors, that you're working with the dead and it's kind of woo woo or anything like that.
Mhm.
It's not, and this to be the case.
Mhm.
It's something universal. We know Italian people, Chinese people. Why can't Black people work with ancestors?
Right.
I think that is a revolutionary movement,
Yes.
uh spiritual movement that's in the world today. There's still some resistance. My
Mhm.
evangelical and fundamentalist relatives don't really like that, but even if you press them and if you frame it in a different way, they're like, oh, okay, it's not all scary. It's not like the dead are going to come out and so I think that is the revolution that we're seeing, the
Mhm.
connection to those who came before us for wisdom, for power. It's not like you're rejecting God or anything. That is the thing that gives hoodoo its
Mhm.
validation and energy. So
Mhm.
I'm seeing more of that than I've ever seen before,
Yes.
and I think that's what's going to carry it to the next iteration. So
Mhm.
yeah, that was
Mhm.
a mouthful.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. Oh, this is so good. Oh, it's so good. I'm not even asking any of the questions I wrote down. Um, but this is so necessary. I am curious though, because we haven't talked about this yet. Do you feel like there's a difference now? Well, let me start by saying yes, ancestral veneration is super important. Uh, always has been, but I think now a lot of folks and young people, as a young
Mhm.
person, are so interested in connecting with
Yes.
their ancestors. They know it is important. They feel it. Religion
Yes.
aside, they want to do it.
Yes.
It's something I talk about all the time, and I love talking about it.
Yes.
The second thing that I think we talk about a lot is that white people should not touch this. They should not be around it. They
Yeah.
should not sniff it. They should not look at it. Don't even say hoodoo out your mouth. Like that is, I think, a lot of my generation's
Yeah.
thoughts around protecting this tradition from outsiders
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
having read and witnessed what it potentially did to your generation, having white people poking pride and how we've interpreted that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious and wondering your thoughts around the openness of this practice. And of course, yeah, just your openness and just what I said. Just want to know your thoughts on what I just shared.
Yeah. This is the hardest thing, and this is something I get asked about by mainly white people.
Mhm.
I've just been asked to speak at this major pay-in conference, and I'm like, I think I'm gonna go down there and make them all upset. But it doesn't have to be upsetting, because I'm actually a gentle person. This is a hard question.
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of a way to dodge it, but no, I need to come to some conclusions on this because whatever I say, someone's gonna be mad. All right. So um there's a perception that hoodoo was somehow stolen. And I'm even thinking in the beginning, hoodoo was stolen by white people. The secrets of hoodoo were taken by
Mhm.
white people. I think that in slavery, at least, that's false, because what the only reason we know that there was hoodoo was because it was practiced secretly in this invisible institution.
Mhm.
There was a more public hoodoo back then, that when I say public, that everyone knew about, that was really parallel to what white people did.
Like
So
the
you had white
marketeering.
no, no, I'm talking really still in the slavery
Oh,
period.
okay, okay.
So people who told fortunes, they called
Oh,
them
okay.
fortune tellers. We would
Mhm.
call them divination. But there were black people who did that, white people who did that. I don't know if they were exchanging or something, but there was a lot of interaction between whites and blacks at an early point. I don't think that the secrets, the stuff that they did in the brush arbor or as part of the invisible institution, I don't think that those were passed on. Of course, I'm not sure what they were, but I don't think they were passed on.
When
So
you say
fast forward,
passed on, what do you mean?
given to outsiders, to
Oh, okay,
people
okay.
outside.
To outsiders. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for correcting.
Oh, wait, you're breaking up.
Great migration. Huh?
Hold on. Okay, you were
Did you
breaking
hear me?
up. Now I can hear you, but
Okay,
you're
I'll
just
start again.
frozen. But
Okay,
yes, please start again.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. I can hear you.
Okay, all right. So after emancipation, uh, the Great Migration,
Mm-hmm.
we know that hoodoo practices come out into the open. We also know that Black folk, particularly Black folk who were educated and trying to educate their children, were strongly against these traditions. All right. And ironically, these were some of the first Black people to study them. They were trying to wipe them out. We also know that after the migration, we get this kind of urban hoodoo that Dr. Katrina Hazard has written about. So that is where white hoodoo and Black hoodoo really sort of intersect. People are exchanging things, people are commodifying, da, 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 da. So I would say white people was in it at an early point, maybe the late 1800s,
Mm-hmm.
if not earlier, if you're not talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then I would say in the 20th century, you begin to get this notion that white people, first it starts with scholars or anthropologists who are like going in here and digging this stuff up and studying it and making the world to see it. You begin to get a perception that they are taking the secrets of the tradition
Mm-hmm.
and then using it for themselves. Toward the part of the
Oh, you're breaking
people,
up again.
you know, saying that they're hoodoo. I broke up again.
Okay, now
Did I
you're
break
back.
up again?
Yeah, now you're back.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to make this shorter so that you can get it because I think it might be my connection. Let me see. Okay. Um, yeah, it's my connection. Um, the idea that white people stole, appropriated, took hoodoo,
Mm-hmm.
and they're trying to make it their own, that was there at the beginning. All
Mm-hmm.
right. That is not anything new. It is also true that white people had their own magical traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And in some parts, in the South in particular, it intersected with Black people. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So today, what we find is what we find with all aspects of Black culture. The white people will take it and make a lot more money on it
Yep.
than for whatever its value than the Black people. I think that's the primary source of the resentment of white people.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they're doing it wrong, not that they're, you know, messing it with it or whatever, but that it's become commodified and they
Mm-hmm.
are gaining prestige and money to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's that, and I think that's a problem. It wouldn't be a problem if hoodoo wasn't commodified already. All right,
Mm.
so it was no longer a sacred art. It's a commodity. And I'm not gonna put you on the spot. I'm not, but this is the 21st century. We buy and sell everything and we got an internet to do it. It might be, and I think that Katrina Hazard was getting toward this too, that authentic hoodoo, what she calls black belt hoodoo, was not meant to be bought and sold in the same
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
So this is a long answer to the question of white involvement. I do not have a problem with it because
Mm.
I do not think that white people have Black ancestors to empower the work. So they may not
Mm.
have the efficacy. All
Right.
right. I think that because we're in this marketplace where everything is commodified, bought and sold, it's probably harder for you to even find authentic hoodoo.
Right.
Again, I keep quoting Katrina Hazard because I think she's the smartest person. She and I agree. You won't find it. If you want a practitioner hoodoo, you're going to go to the church and find somebody who does it. You're not going to
Mhm.
find. I mean, you might find them online, or you might find them in a botanica or a spiritual shop. So this is to say that, on the one hand, yeah, they take everything. They take everything from, and they have a facsimile, and then they buy, and that becomes the thing. The other part that so I'm okay with it, but this is what I'm not okay with, and this is something that we've seen. There was an argument that, well, it's not an African tradition, that it's not a Black tradition. And as I said, there's white hoodoo stuff, there's Appalachian hoodoo. I know people do this, but there was a subtle argument, and it was followed quickly with, well, white people were enslaved too, and in particular the Irish. And the
Mm-hmm.
argument was that the word hoodoo actually comes from the Irish, which it may, that almost like usurping um black, and we've seen this, they do this with everything.
Mm-hmm.
When I saw that, I was like, okay, I'm going to watch this because this is kind of dangerous. In 100 years we will be erased from this tradition. But even though there were white slaves, and even though there were, no, it's not the same thing.
Right.
So that to me is the more insidious and problematic
Mm.
argument about involvement. Some people also object to when I write about the influences from Native American people,
Mm-hmm.
Indian people, and white people, Europeans, on this tradition. So I can back up those sources.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, so this is a long answer. I think that anyone can take part in this. They and not everyone has black or African ancestors, all
Hmm.
right? Although they probably do, because everybody goes back to Africa. So that's kind of interesting to me. But I think that if the ancestors take the lead, you'll be less likely to dabble or to take part in an African tradition.
Right.
The other objection is just more personal. I don't think white people should practice, and I don't know if you can include this, Sam,
Okay.
but this comes out of my experience in Vodou,
Mm-hmm.
because I've been in black Vodou houses, I've been in Haitian houses, and I've been in white houses. The white people don't have soul, and I will say that they don't have soul. What do you mean? And they get all red,
Mm-hmm.
and they get tears in their eyes because I'm being very sincere. And some of them know exactly what I'm saying, and they're like, "Yeah," but it's like you do not have soul, and I can't describe it. The way when you sing, even when
Right.
you shout. I saw this white woman. This is an aside. I think she was one of the advisors to President Trump, and she was shouting and
Oh
preaching.
yes.
I
Uh-huh.
was like, I'm looking close, and I'm like, that's still a facsimile. That's a parrot. And
Right.
she's made a lot of money off
Yes.
of being a minstrel, so they can be hoodoo minstrels, but
Mm.
they don't have the soul,
The
and that is
juju, the soul,
the
right.
the thing. I can't describe it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
hard. But so that's why I don't have an issue. But
Interesting.
I know a lot of people are so angry that I'm on this. Well, I'm in this group right now on Facebook. There's one, they don't want the white people, and there's one that has them in there. And there's just so much anger at what they see as the obliviousness of these
Mm-hmm.
well-meaning white people. They don't understand that they always take, they always
Right.
take, even when they don't. And the other thing, and this happens on Facebook a lot. I know you know it always becomes about them. So we're up there talking about hoodoo or something spiritual, and when they arrive, it shifts, it centers
Yes.
them. So
Yes.
and that, I don't. How do you blame people? That's the nature of white supremacy. So
Mm.
the long answer is I don't have a problem with it, but I see the problems that emerge from white people claiming this. But
Mm.
it's no different from any other cultural art form that we've created, right?
Okay.
They
Right.
take it and then they do the thing that's a facsimile or a minstrel, and
Mm-hmm.
they make lots of money.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the money thing, the commodification, is more of a
A big part
problem.
of it. Right.
Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay.
I know, but you know what? I would be willing to argue. I would be willing to argue this.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this one thing though. While I don't have a problem with white people saying they practice or part. I think that African American hoodoo is separate from what other people do. So there's lots of
Mm.
hoodoo practitioners. There's one I know. He says, "Well, I do Appalachian hoodoo." I know people here in this state, they do hoodoo, but it's not. It's and powwow work. That's
Mm-hmm.
not black. So there is a black and an African American tradition of hoodoo that includes ancestral veneration, and then there's all other kinds of
There's
hoodoos.
others.
I think what Katrina,
Right.
yeah, the market, what she calls marketeered hoodoo. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Okay.
So that's my position.
So I
But
get it. It's
hey,
it's
do
more
you
so
agree
that
or
you're
not?
saying
Okay,
that
yeah,
there's different categories of hoodoo. And so yeah, y'all
yeah,
can do quote you can be in hoodoo. You're not gonna be in black hoodoo because you don't have
yeah,
the sauce, the sazon to even
yes, that's it.
to 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 effectively do black hoodoo. You can't do that. But
Yeah.
y'all can do your
Yeah.
stuff, but it's not gonna be this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yes.
Because
There
you
you
can't
go.
access this stuff.
There you go. There you go. There you go.
I
You
get it.
get it.
I
You
get
get
it.
it.
I
Mhm.
get it. I get it. Now, that's my first time understanding hoodoo as being a bigger term and including other groups. And maybe that's another interview, another conversation, because I've never heard of
Yeah.
Appalachian hoodoo or other folks
Yeah.
calling hoodoo
Oh.
hoodoo. I thought hoodoo was just a black thing in
Yep.
general.
Yep, yep.
So,
Yeah, but see, this is the danger. In 100 years, if people have their way, that will be the other hoodoo is going to be what hoodoo is. So that's why I say,
right.
as long as we if we keep this with the ancestral tradition, if we keep this and we say it's Africana, or
Got
it's
it.
clear. But
Interesting.
so yeah, there's lots of different hoodoos. That's something that's really interesting to me. It's
Interesting.
regional.
Mhm.
It's you got Christian hoodoo now. You got, so a lot
Hmm.
of it is just a matter of people labeling it. They said, well, I always did this. Some people call it witchcraft, but
Hmm.
I'm seeing the varieties, and that's really interesting to me, the varieties of it. And that fits into your earlier question that nowadays it's much more likely African American hoodoo is much more likely to be eclectic and include some things that the ancestors might not have done, like crystals or Reiki or something
Mhm.
like that. You see?
Mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
mhm, mhm. Fair. I got you. I got you. Um,
Okay. Good.
that was good. I got you. So we're closing out. I do want to ask you one more question as we finish up, and I just want to know your advices to younger hoodoos, to folks studying Africana religions, and what do you think is important for us to carry as we continue on this tradition, this legacy, these questions, these
Yeah.
ideas? Like, what do you have to
Yeah.
bestow on us as we?
Good. We've already talked about the ancestral roots.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that's like the first thing before you get into anything exotic, or you go to your ancestors. But along with that, and now that I'm older, I'm beginning to really appreciate this, is turning to the living elders. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hazard and I were talking about this. There really is not a council of elders, the people who were there, the people who have the wisdom. And I don't really know if the young people are turning. I mean, you said even in your family, you've come back to your grandparents, but I or your grandmother. I know a lot of young people either don't have those relationships,
Yeah.
or they learn from books.
Right.
I would say the living book is the book that we need to do, and we need to do this soon, because a lot of us, the elders, are leaving right now, and that's
Yes.
not an accident. I mean,
Mhm.
people are like, oh, all these people are dying. It's not. This is this it We are getting ready to shift to the next generation.
Yeah.
So seeking out the elders respectfully, all right, uh looking to them for wisdom. I would
Mhm.
say that that's up there with ancestors if
Right.
you want to really take this tradition seriously and be a part of it. It's like joining a religion house, or joining an Africana religion. You
Mhm.
got a god you got godparents, and you respect them, you learn from them. We don't have that in hoodoo because it's not a religion, but I think the format is still the same. You
Ooh, that was a
must.
spicy statement. It's not a
Oh,
religion. We didn't get into that, but we're gonna keep going. Spicy.
yeah, no, that's my book. It's like it's religion like, but it's not a religion.
Mm.
It's cultural though, because people treat it like it's religion, like it's sacred. But um you must listen to the elders. You
Mhm.
must respect the elders. And that I find young people are in such a hurry, like I was when I was younger. And I'm talking about younger than you, because
Mhm.
you're actually moving toward the middle, like almost an old elder, heaven forbid, not 60, but the younger people are very impatient, like we all are. You've
Mhm.
got to turn to those people who hold the wisdom, or else that
Mhm.
will be lost. Or even worse, speaking of white people, they're the ones who will go in and sit for hours and days at the feet of these people collecting their stories.
Mm.
So that would be my advice. Seek out the elders. If they're not in your family, you have a community of elders. Um, It takes digging, it takes dedication, because this
Yes.
stuff is they're not on the internet.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that would be my advice. The ancestral piece, don't forget that. And study history.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just in an argument about that. Well, he's white. I was like, he wrote one of the best books ever, and I shouldn't have told you he was white. I don't care if it's history. You can tell as soon as you open it. Study history, study books, and then talk to the elders, those who came before you, who can give you some wisdom about it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's my advice. I already sound like an elder. I just turned 60 and I sound like an elder. You listen, you young people listen. But I mean, there's something to that, right? Because people are leaving the
Mm.
body right now. There is a
Mm-hmm.
collective that is forming, a
Yes.
powerful collective. So we got to get what we can right now. So, but it's beautiful. I love the work you're doing. I
Mm-hmm.
love the teaching that you're doing. You're very disciplined about it. I know a lot of people dabble in this stuff and they have fun, and it is fun and it is beautiful, but
Mm-hmm.
this is work. They
Yes.
called it work before they
The
called it
work.
Hoodoo, they called it
Mm-hmm.
work. So I respect that. You know, that let me just say this before you and I'm not
Oh
blowing
wait,
smoke
one
up your
second.
ass.
1 second, because it's one that.
Okay,
Okay.
okay.
Okay, we're good.
I will just say that you and people like you who are doing this, promoting this, are doing a great service, all right? Because you're honest. It's clear you're not doing this for the money and you're not doing this for the fame or whatever. So that's what I would encourage you. That's all
Mm-hmm.
that I have to offer, to continue doing this work on behalf of other people, on behalf of the younger people. So
Mm-hmm.
so I thank
Great.
you for that, because
Thank you.
this was not around when I was writing, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
just so happy to see that this is a topic of conversation, because it's important to us. This is
Yes.
this is our this is a heritage project. This is our heritage, and
Yes.
it might be endangered. I don't think it is, but it might be endangered. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you take it seriously.
Yes, I do. And thank you. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for your work. Thank you for leaving us with things that we
Okay.
can learn from and
Yeah.
incorporate and think on. I'm going to be thinking on a lot of things that you said today. And I also often am returning to your book. So just I appreciate you too for creating the space for me to be able to create the space for other people to keep creating space. So thank you so much for this wonderful interview. And I know
Thank
folks are
you.
gonna love it. So thank you so
Thank-
much.
Okay.
Confirm no say, and I'll never get played.